My name is Jared Cohon. I'm the former president of Carnegie Mellon University and a member of the board of the Eradicate Hate Global Summit. This is the National Government in Action panel. We're going to focus on public-private collaboration, but also international collaboration. But juxtaposed as we are between the state governments in action before us and the private sector in action after us, and this video is a good reminder, collaboration with the states in the US is particularly important as well. We're very fortunate we have a panel made up of the national leaders of 3 countries focused on the prevention of targeted violence. We have John Picarelli down at the end there, who's Director of Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention of the U.S. National Security Council. Next to him is Bill Braniff, who we have to thank for that video, Director of the Department of Homeland Security Center for Prevention Programs and Partnerships. Next to me, and I'm introducing them in the order in which they're going to be speaking, is Rob Burley, Executive Director of Public Safety Canada's Center for Community Engagement and Prevention of Violence. And next to him is Cathrine Thorleifsson. She's from the University of Oslo, but also heads Norway's Commission on Extremism and is very involved with the EU as well. So we have a wonderful representation here of the national leaders in their nations for targeted violence prevention. Each of them is going to speak for about 5 minutes, and then we'll have a discussion and some questions. And we'll start with John Picarelli. John?
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. It's lovely to be back in Pittsburgh. Sadly, I wasn't able to join everyone last year because COVID happened right before the conference. So what I want to talk about today is kind of set the landscape into which my colleagues are going to speak about more specifics, and that is, I want to use what the Biden-Harris administration has been focused on the last 2 years to run 2 key themes out for a little bit. And those 2 key themes are, 1, that whatever it is going to be the solution to the targeted violence and terrorism that we face, not only here in the United States, but around the globe, really is going to rely on partnerships between the public sector, the private sector, in all of its capacities. And the second is that it is also going to rely on partnerships amongst nation states, amongst experts in other countries. So let me start with where this administration began, which was a 100-day rapid review that led to the National Strategy for Countering Domestic Terrorism. And in that strategy are 4 pillars that I think really start to set up these 2 themes. So in your first pillar of the National Strategy for Countering Domestic Terrorism is very much focused on information sharing, on improving our understanding of domestic terrorism and ensuring that understanding gets to all of our partners. And again, there's that word. A lot of what you'll find in Pillar 1 talks about how to enhance this information sharing, but it's with state and local partners, the private sector, and many others. Then we move to Pillar 2, which is a lot of what we've been talking about the last 3 days, prevention, both online and in our communities. And again, it is emphasized that this has to happen through our state and local partners here in the United States, but also internationally. So a great example of how the federal government is trying to do this work at the state and local level, and I'm not going to talk about CP3, which is another fantastic example, defer to my colleague, but a great example of this is the Prevention Resource Finder, the first ever comprehensive web repository of federal resources available to state and local partners to prevent acts of targeted violence and terrorism. We launched the site in March, in large part thanks to our colleagues at DHS, who took the burden of building it and working with our interagency colleagues to gather up all the resources that we can. And we currently have over 100 resources on that website, financial, educational, technical assistance that is available from the federal government to state and local partners, be they government or non-governmental. The third pillar of this strategy focuses on looking to use all of our authorities to investigate and prosecute acts of domestic terrorism. And here again, there are a number of elements in there where there is training and other efforts that are being done to help state and local partners. But really where I wanted to key in today and kind of continue these themes is in the fourth pillar, which is often overlooked. And in the fourth pillar is an attempt to say, hey, domestic terrorism is not in a vacuum. It exists in a broader ecosphere, something we've been talking about here for the past few days. And there are a number of long-term issues that need to be tackled for us to successfully address this. And so the administration has launched a further series of efforts that are focused on, and this is in part what we're doing in Pillar 4, there's other elements, but it's focused on the reduction of hate crimes that buttress and support our efforts to combat domestic terrorism. So a great example of this was the President's United We Stand Summit last year, I believe it was almost a year ago this month, that outlined an agenda to counter the destructive effects of hate-fueled violence against our democracy and against our public safety. It mobilized diverse sectors of society and communities around a shared, inclusive, and bipartisan vision for a more united America. And let me give you an example of this. A number of former White House officials from all administrations, Republican or Democrat, launched Dignity.us, a citizens' initiative to address hate-fueled violence in America, designed to foster dialogue in communities across the country and identify solutions that addressed hate-fueled violence. The Citizens Initiative is coordinated by four former directors of the White House Domestic Policy Council. That includes from Presidents Obama, Bush, Clinton, and Gerald Ford. And Dignity.us is a website that you can go visit and see their progress. So as we come out of the United We Stand Summit, we have our efforts against domestic terrorism in the national strategy, concomitant issues on other forms of terrorism. We have United We Stand. The recognition coming out of United We Stand was we weren't done yet. And so as I onboarded with the National Security Council last October, one of the very first things that I had dropped on my desk was a plan to move forward addressing further hate with some specific initiatives. And on December 12th of last year, that became an interagency policy council that counter anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and related forms of bias and discrimination. This was directed by the President to the Domestic Policy Council and the National Security Council to develop new solutions to these problems. And we were asked first to start with developing the first ever national strategy to combat anti-Semitism. I could probably spend hours talking about this. I can see everybody panicking. Let me just say that in 5 months, 1,000 separate engagements with Jewish and other community leaders across the country, and innumerable interagency meetings. What results this past May 23rd is the launch of the first ever national strategy to combat anti-Semitism that contains over 100 actions from 24 agencies, all focused on reducing anti-Semitism in the United States. Another 100 calls on society to buttress this work. And the pillars of that national strategy are similar to where we start with domestic terrorism. Number one, raise awareness of anti-Semitism and the threat that it poses to Jewish community and all Americans. 2, address anti-Semitic harassment and abuse, both online and offline. 3, prevent anti-Semitic attacks and incidents. And 4, encourage whole of society efforts to counter anti-Semitism and build a more inclusive nation. I will note that in each of these things that I have mentioned here today, we were in lockstep with our international partners. For example, in the development of the anti-Semitism strategy, we met with a number of foreign envoys who were in charge of similar strategies in their own countries, and we drew on their work. And let me conclude here. These are strategies. Hey, that's great. That's wonderful. We have plans. What are you doing about it? This past June, we launched a fact sheet on the White House website that documents our progress implementing the national strategy to combat domestic terrorism for the first 2 years of its existence. 2 weeks ago, we launched another fact sheet that documents what we've done in the past year coming out of United We Stand to address hate-fueled violence and discrimination. And finally, and one of the reasons why I have significant bags under my eyes, is just yesterday we launched another fact sheet documenting for the first time efforts that have been made to advance Title VI civil rights enforcements from a number of different federal agencies in support of the anti-Semitism strategy. And it goes on to talk about the numerous accomplishments that have been made just in the first 3 months of the anti-Semitism strategy having been published.
John, thanks. We're going to have to leave it there so we can move on. Thank you for that excellent overview from the highest level. Bill Braniff is from the Department of Homeland Security and is involved in more specifics. Let's hear about those, Bill.
Thank you, Jared. So the first day I arrived at the Department of Homeland Security 5 months ago, the acting director at the time, Jenny Presswalla, handed me a draft strategy to adopt a public health-informed approach to targeted violence and terrorism prevention. And it's fantastic because Jenny learned through her years of experience working with state-level collaborators, the University of Denver, the mental health, behavioral health community, the human services professionals in Colorado, that what we really need to address these issues long-term are lessons that we've learned over the past 35 years from the Centers for Disease Control and their efforts to prevent other forms of violence. For 30 plus years, we've been building an evidence base on how to decrease the likelihood of suicide, domestic partner violence, community-based violence. And so by learning from those examples and redomaining that knowledge into the targeted violence space, we can take an evidence-based approach. We can invest in the health and wellness of communities. Because it's primary prevention, we could intentionally invest in building the protective factors that help our individuals, our families, our peers, our communities, our schools stay safe. We can also invest in secondary prevention. These are things like behavioral threat assessment and management teams that serve as a referral mechanism. So if someone sees someone that they have concerns about, just concerns, behavioral concerns, they can help that person get access to direct services and management of those services to reduce risk over time. And then we can invest in tertiary prevention, rehabilitation, and reintegration of those individuals who have broken the law and de-risk the likelihood that they will reoffend. This is a really comprehensive, holistic approach. And one of the best parts about it, to my mind, is that it is overwhelmingly strengths-based. We're leveraging the strengths of communities and increasing those strengths to crowd out vulnerabilities on the margins. It allows us to work by, with, and through local partners. As you saw in the New York State video, the incredible work that the state of New York is doing really reminds me of the incredible work that the state of Colorado has done, and we're just learning from that experience. There are many of those colleagues in the room, McKenna from the State Homeland Security Agency, the great Rachel Nielsen with McCain now, formerly University of Denver. Right, we've learned so much from these individuals, and we've been able to incorporate that into our strategy, curate the evidence base from these experiences, and then develop technical packages that we take back out to the field to support the replication of this work in other places. I want to highlight one program quickly to just give you an example of what does it mean to invest in the strengths of a local population. Working through our partners, McCain and EdVenture Partners, we're able to invest in high schools and college communities, have students build programs that build positive cultures that decrease the likelihood of violence over time. Right? It's really rare for a government entity to be able to spend time and energy investing in strengths before a crisis occurs to decrease the likelihood that will occur, but then also build the safety nets should someone progress down the pathway to violence. It's been really inspiring to see what Jenny worked on with her colleagues at the state and local level manifest as a strategy, and now being able to support others around the country to learn from those lessons. So we're standing on the shoulders of the CDC, we're standing on the shoulders of our state and local partners, and I think doing something really transformative with this new public health informed strategy. And would love to chat with anyone who's interested in learning more about it.
Great. Thank you, Bill. We'll move now to Canada. Rob Burley, as I mentioned before, heads up Canada's Center for Community Engagement and Violence Prevention. I've heard you describe your agency as a one-stop shop. Tell us about that, and particularly about your partnerships, both domestically and internationally.
Super. Thank you, Jared. Good morning. Bonjour. I'm delighted to be here as part of a really strong Canadian presence from government, academia, civil society, about 20 of us. And I want to thank Laura and the impeccable Global Summit team for welcoming so many of us from the Great White North. Canada, too, is struggling with these issues. 20 months ago, our capital city of Ottawa was occupied for 3 weeks by the so-called Freedom Convoy. And while not a violent extremist event in itself, those groups and individuals used it as a recruiting tool and to spread conspiracies that resonate today. This very week, just up the road in London, Ontario, is the trial of a young man on terrorist charges for driving his truck into a Muslim family, killing 4 people. And so we are developing government strategies to try and deal with these threats. We aren't using terminology in our government anymore of right-wing extremism, left-wing extremism. We find those terms to be too politically charged, something that our American friends might know a thing or two about. And they're just too simplistic when you see multiple and shifting motivations. So we really are focusing on the motivations, and the most common term now used by our government is ideologically motivated violent extremism. That brings us to the Canada Centre, created 6 years ago as a one-stop shop. So we have a funding arm, we have a research group, and we lead on policy for our government in leading Canada's national strategy on countering radicalization to violence. Our funding arm, the Community Resilience Fund, I'm delighted that so many of our partners are here at this conference. It includes Yorktown Family Services, Digital Public Square, White Ribbon, the John Howard Society of Ottawa, and our international partners, Moonshot, Mulfahun, Institute for Strategic Dialogue. Our research group is led by Brett Kubicek, who many of you know, and the mandate for our research arm is building, sharing, and using knowledge as Canada's, our government's center of expertise on these issues, and a really important convening role. So the beginning of May, we held a slightly smaller international conference on CRV called Mega Week, and we were delighted that John and Laura were able to come up to Ottawa for that. And our policy arm, so we lead on terrorist and violent extremist content issues for our government. We're developing an online safety bill for Canada, so stay tuned. We're contributing to Canada's action plan on combating hate. And recently, our Minister of Public Safety appointed a national experts committee on CRV to help give us guidance on trends and gaps. All to say, we're taking a holistic approach that complements but is distinct from our government's national security and law enforcement approaches. We're adopting, like John described, a public health model with a real focus on evaluation and evidence base. If I could throw up the slide on international engagement to distract you from my monotone voice. This is to give you just a sampling of the kinds of international engagement that we have. It's bilateral through the Canada-US roadmap, where we've created a violent extremist dialogue between our two governments. It's working with our like-minded governments, the Five Eyes, the G7, in the UN and the OECD. And the two in the middle are really important. You've heard about GIFCT and the Christchurch Call to Action this week. Those are multi-stakeholder forums like Eradicate Hate Global Summit. And Canada has invested early and deeply into those multi-stakeholder environments, bringing together governments, industry, civil society to look for solutions. And we invest so much in these international partnerships, and I'll conclude on this point for 3 reasons. Because, as John Donne said, no man is an island, and no government and country can do this by itself. So we have lessons to learn from other countries' approaches. Secondly, it's about advancing international standards and raising the bar globally. And thirdly, ensuring that prevention is firmly part of the toolkit of our government and others around the world. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Rob. Cathrine, so talk to us. You represent all of Europe at the moment, so do that in 5 minutes.
Thank you. And I do not, unfortunately, represent Europe, since Norway is not a part of the European Union. But thank you. Thank you for the warm welcome, and thank you to the organizers. 22nd of July, 2011, I was sitting in the library writing a book about political violence in Israel. I had recently moved back to Norway from Israel after spending several years in the Middle East, in a country characterized by the absence of peace, writing about the drivers of terrorist violence. Suddenly, I heard a bomb go off, and I wrote to my supervisor in London, I heard a bomb go off. Images started occurring. Media commentators were speculating, was this an Al-Qaeda attack? And when the first images occurred, I was shocked. The image of a terrorist whom I knew, I went to school with him, we grew up in the same streets. I acknowledge that there are survivors of the atrocities 22nd of July in this room. The terrorists drove to the government quarters, and before driving to the Utøya Island, killing 77 people, the majority minors. This also shifted my trajectory for research, so I started researching white supremacy, mobilization, and terrorism at the Center for Research on Extremism. And it was a great honor that last year I was seconded by the government to head its Commission on Extremism, mandated to provide advice on how to better strategies for preventing and countering violent extremism. The Commission was wanted by the victims itself. It was the kids that were survivors of that atrocious attacks that demanded justice, that demanded also truth and reconciliation, that demanded that we went deeper into these cases, to the drivers of radicalization. How could this happen in a country that's so peaceful, where there's high trust in law enforcement, in government? The Commission consists of 23 people representing various sectors, from academia, research, to mental health, local government, victims and bereaved of the Utøya attack, non-profit, civil society, faith communities. So it's a mini Eradicate Hate, a whole of society approach into prevention. We located also under the Ministry of Labour and Social Inclusion, and not the Ministry of Justice. So it shows that the logic for it is early prevention, is really reducing those risk factors and also implementing policies that can ensure that these do not happen again. The past year we have been collecting data across 351 municipalities. We have been interviewing more than 100 actors from various sectors and services, going also with delegations to selected countries in Northwestern Europe, and also including the initiatives you mentioned. We had meetings with also the RAN and the European Union. And I think what is so vital in this field is, of course, when we now publish our report in February, so I cannot talk too much about the specific recommendations, but there is potential for standardization, professionalization. We need to have the robust structures in place at the national, regional, and local level, and to professionalize the field. And how can we do that? By bringing people together. In the local municipalities, we have interdisciplinary threat assessment teams. At the regional level, we have contact points for radicalization. And at the national level, there's government action plans that includes action plans against anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, racism, hatred against the LGBTQI community. But we need to look at this intersectionality. Because as we know, 22nd of July inspired atrocious attacks in Christchurch, in Buffalo, Poway, El Paso, Bratislava, Halle. And we see how the perpetrators were primarily inspired by the conspiratorial belief in the Great Replacement theory, white genocide, anti-Semitism as core at it, but they also targeted mosques, the Black community, Latino community, the LGBTQI community, inspired by the eclectic nature of internet culture. And this goes back to the panel here. So how can Canada, the US, and EU, Norway collaborate better? Because the 22nd of July terrorist, he used the internet in 2011 in all the phases of his radicalization, from belonging, from gamifying, to uploading a manifesto. This is a transatlantic co-production of dehumanizing propaganda, propaganda that is identical to the 1930s. The only newness is its viral spread. The humor is the same, the anti-Semitic cartoons the same, but there's a technology that are being misused. The previous panel spoke about online regulation. We will also implement the Digital Service Act in Norwegian legislation, but it's not enough. It doesn't reach the fringe platforms, it do not reach the digital subcultures where you have the international communities meeting. So I believe that the human is the answer. We need to also have more programs that fosters resilience to conspiratorial thinking and disinformation. We also need to have better and more interactive preventative work online, not just removing content, not just redirecting, but also working to build healthy and sustainable communities and digital villages and cities and global communities. So it's an honor to be here, and thank you.
Thank you, Cathrine. So I want to drill down and try to get specific here with regard to public-private collaboration. Collaboration ran through everybody's remarks here, and it's clearly essential. It's clearly recognized by you individually and by your agencies and commissions. But to sort of put some meat on the bones, as it were, there was a panel yesterday afternoon on the financial services sector. They were talking about money flows and how extremist groups get supported. And there was an interesting point made, interesting to me, that while in this country the national government can't intervene or cut off the flow of money to an extremist group, they can collect data and they can present that data to financial institutions, leaving it to the financial institutions to make their own risk assessments and decisions, as in, oh, we don't want to be affiliated with an organization like that, interrupting the flow. So there's an example of a clear public-private collaboration, which is really quite creative. So I'm looking at my US colleagues, wondering, so is that a model for the sorts of things, specific things that the government can get involved in? And I'm looking at my international colleagues and wondering, does this work? Do we see a similar thing developing in your countries? So I don't want to, Bill, you're looking at me or like you're ready to respond. Go ahead.
Always. Sure. So one of the lines of effort at the Center for Prevention Programs and Partnerships, acknowledging that we need to do this through partnerships, is our strategic engagement team. And their job is to engage with sectors across the United States, both in the private sector and public, to identify those big muscle groups, those private sector muscle groups that can be used to bring resources to set the conditions, create the conditions in their corporations or in their tech sector more broadly that facilitate prevention work. So you can imagine working with the gaming community. You can imagine working in other parts of the tech sector. You mentioned financial services. I had a really interesting conversation yesterday with representatives from Boston's Children's Hospital, which is one of the grantees that we've been fortunate to support over the years, and how important it is that the clinic that they work for has access to insurance that covers them, protects the liability for those clinicians, so they can freely take on these targeted violence referral cases without fear of losing their licenses. So there are levers we need to pull between the government and then the private sector, such as the insurance industry, that enables direct service providers to participate in this work. If we don't do those things, they're taking undue risk potentially, and the risk of losing their livelihoods, for example. So I think there's lots of reasons why public-private partnerships are necessary if we're going to really move sort of this in a strategic way and not just scattershot, small, isolated projects around the country. If we're going to do this in a more cogent way, we need those big muscle groups to be leaning in with us.
So this is a great example. Did you come to realize the importance of insurance coverage by interacting with Boston Children's?
Yes.
Or that's how it came about?
Everything that we have learned is from the practitioners on the ground actually doing the work.
Good.
And our job is to listen to them and then share the results of that work, whether it's our grant program, our student teams, our state partners. We just released on September 6th something called the Grantee Results website, which is part of the Center for Prevention Programs and Partnerships website, in which all of the lessons that our grantees are learning are now being made public to expedite the lessons learned process and allow others to benefit from that.
That's very good. Rob, Cathrine, specific examples of this sort in private collaboration from your countries?
Sure, I can give one. I completely agree with Bill that governments alone don't have exclusive roles to play, and in some cases need to get out of the way. In Canada, one of our great successes has been collaborating with the Canadian Practitioners Network on prevention, led by Dr. Haida Hassan at the University of Quebec in Montreal. And this network across the country is one that we have helped fund to initiate its creation, and it is one that we continue to collaborate with on a frequent and regular basis, bringing that frontline expertise that Bill described to fora that they might not otherwise have access to, including having them speak to our public officials to help bring that frontline perspective, to help influence the development of policy and programs. So it's one of our proudest and closest collaborations, CPN-Prev.
You know, Cathrine, both the examples that Bill and Rob gave also speak to the issue I know that you've thought a lot about of scaling, pushing things out so that they really get adopted. So with best practices and what Rob just told us. Tell us about that and what you're doing in Norway.
So in Norway, the PCV structures are primarily state-led, so it's very much government-centered structures, but there's great potential for involving civil society and also the private sector even more, I would say, having spoken to lots of actors. And we see now current also programming that is involving the gaming community and young users of digital spaces themselves, from the space of acknowledging that these are spaces for friendship and creativity, but from that acknowledgement also how to counter racism and misogyny in those spaces. So that's very promising programming where you see companies are also involved in all the phases from development, programming, and evaluation. But I think there's more great potential, and I think it's also we're speaking about also sharing and learning from best practices. And I think that needs to be rapidly shared and routinely shared. Because one finding with the Commission now is that you have first-line practitioners that feel that they're quite alone with their work and they need the support structures. and to meet frequently with others in the field. And we feel that also we identify bystanders that feel lonely. They don't have the necessary support structures around them, so we can also implement guidelines for parents and caregivers, for teachers, for practitioners, and do that also in collaboration both with civil society actors and also with private companies.
Good. So you all clearly know each other and you stay in touch with each other, but are there formal relationships between and among our governments when it comes to prevention of violence? Yes?
Yeah,
Okay.
many. I'll give two quick examples. One is Five Eyes. For those of you who don't know, that's the five Anglosphere governments and a security and intelligence sharing protocol between Canada, the US, UK, Australia, and New Zealand. And within the Five Eyes, we support our governments and ministers' meetings by having working groups on countering violent extremism, both on the policy side and on the research side. So I often see Bill, for example, in those meetings where we're looking at some of the challenges that are common between our countries and figuring out how we can advance them through the most senior levels of our government. We do the same at the G7, and it's really about bringing prevention into the conversation so that it's not just a reflex of our senior leaders to the counterterrorism and law enforcement toolkit.
Very good. And can you comment on this, Cathrine?
Well, Norway is a small country, only 5.5 million people, and it's outside of the EU. But it supports the Christchurch Call. It's also frequently attending RAN events, so that's European Commission's multi-stakeholder for practitioners, policy, and also victims working groups. But I think there's even more greater potential. So you have big muscles like the US, Canada, the UK, the Christchurch calls, but you also have smaller nation states also affected by violent extremism and terrorism, Bratislava, Slovakia, that can work through the EU, of course, but there also needs to be other ways to include smaller states as well. So the frequent structures for collaboration and also for knowledge exchange are needed across the board.
We're going to have to wrap up. Are there any last remarks? Any last shots? Go ahead, John.
So I just want to add, I think formal intergovernmental multilateral institutions in prevention are important, and there's many of them. Our State Department has at least 6 or 7 that are up and running that really try and draw in everyone from around the globe, but it's the informal ones that are equally important. And here yesterday, you had the Radicalization Awareness Network from the EU meeting with similar networks here in the United States and Canada. And what I mean by therefore informal is, it's good for all of us to get together and talk. It's more important for the practitioners to start talking directly to one another and garnering and developing that practice that needs to happen. It just makes our lives easier. So I think it's important to recognize that this is happening at 2 different levels.
Thank you for that, John. It's a great note to end on. In 45 minutes on such a huge topic, you can only just scratch the surface, but I think we put a pretty deep scratch into it, a lot to follow up on. Please join me in thanking these excellent panelists. Thank you very much.